Their lives, at least Lesejos, did not change much with marriage. He still liked lounging around the village. The rainy season had come and life was easy for the cattlemen at this time because there was enough water and grazing for the animals. He wasn't the kind of man to fuss about the house, and during his time, he only made 3 pronouncements about the household. He took control of all the money. She had to ask him for it and state what it was to be used for. Then he didn't like the transistor radio blaring the whole day long.
Women who keep that thing going the whole day have nothing in their heads,
he said. Then he looked down at her from a great height and commented finally and quietly,
"If you go with those men again, I'll kill you."
This was said so indifferently and quietly, as though he never really expected his authority and dominance to encounter any challenge. She hadn't the mental equipment to analyze what had hit her, but something seemed to strike her a terrible blow behind the head. She instantly succumbed to the blow and rapidly began to fall apart. On the surface, the everyday round of village life was deadly dull in its even, unbroken monotony. One day slipped easily into another, drawing water, stamping corn, and cooking food. But within this, there were enormous tugs and pulls between people. Custom demanded that people care about each other, and all day long there was this constant traffic of people in and out of each other's lives. Someone had to be buried. Sympathy and help were demanded for this event. There were money loans, newborn babies, sorrow, trouble, gifts. Lesego had long been the king of this world. There was every day a long string of people wanting something or wanting to give him something in gratitude for a past favor. It was the basic strength of village life. It created people whose sympathetic and emotional responses were always fully awakened, and it rewarded them by richly filling in a void that was one big gaping yawn. When the hysteria and cheap rowdiness were taken away, life fell into a yawn. She had nothing inside herself to cope with this way of life that had finally caught up with her. The beer brewing women were still there. They still liked her yard because Lesego was casual and easygoing, and all that went on in it now, like the old men squatting in corners with gifts.
"Lesego, I had good luck with my hunting today. I caught 2 rabbits and I want to share one with you,"
was simply the Tswana way of life that they too lived. In keeping with their queen's new status, they said,
"We are women and we must do something."
They collected earth and dung and smeared and decorated life's courtyard. They drew water for her, stamped her corn, and things looked quite ordinary on the surface because Lesego also liked a pot of beer. No one noticed the expression of anguish that had crept into life's face. The boredom of the daily round was almost throttling her to death, and no matter which way she looked, from the beer brewers to her husband to all the people who called, she found no one with whom she could communicate what had become an actual physical pain. After a month, she was near collapse. One morning, she mentioned her agony to the beer brewers.
"I think I have made a mistake. Married life doesn't suit me."
And they replied sympathetically,
"No, you're just getting used to it. After all, it's a different life in Johannesburg."
The neighbors went further. They were impressed by a marriage they thought could never succeed. They started saying that one never ought to judge a human being who was both good and bad. And Lesego had turned a bad woman into a good woman, which was something they had never seen before. Just as they were saying this and nodding their approval, Sodom and Gomorrah started up all over again. Lesego had received word late in the evening that the newborn calves at his cattle posts were dying, and early the next morning he was off again in his truck. The old, reckless, wild woman awakened from a state near death with a huge sigh of relief. The transistor blared. The food flowed again. The men and women reeled around dead drunk. Simply by their din, they beat off all the unwanted guests who nodded their heads grimly. When Letsecho came back, they were going to tell him that this was no wife for him. 3 days later, Letsecho unexpectedly was back in the village. The calves were all anemic, and they had to be brought into the vet for an injection. He drove his truck straight through the village to the vet's camp. One of the beer brewers saw him and hurried in alarm to her friend.
"The husband is back! The husband is back!"
she said fearfully, pulling life to one side.
"Ach,"
she replied irritably. She did dispel the noise, the men, and the drink, but a wild anger was driving her to break out of the way of life that was like death to her. She told one of the men she'd see him at 6 o'clock. At about 5 o'clock, Lesego drove into the yard with the calves. There was no one immediately around to greet him. He jumped out of the truck and walked to one of the huts. Pushing open the door, Life was sitting on the bed. She looked up silently and sullenly. He was a little surprised, but his mind was still distracted by the calves. He had to settle them in the yard for the night.
"Will you make some tea?"
he said. "I'm very thirsty."
"There's no sugar in the house,"
she said.
"I'll have to get some."
Something irritated him, but he hurried back to the calves, and his wife walked out of the yard. Lesego had just settled the calves when a neighbor walked in. He was very angry.
"Lesego,"
he said bluntly.
"we told you not to marry that woman. If you go to the yard of Raditobolo, if you go to the yard now, you'll find her in bed with him. Go and see for yourself that you may leave that bad woman."
Lesego stared quietly at him for a moment. Then at his own pace, as though there were no haste or chaos in life, he went to the hut they used as a kitchen. A tin full of sugar stood there. He turned and found a knife in the corner, one of the large ones he used for slaughtering cattle, and slipped it into his shirt. Then at his own pace, he walked to the yard of Raditobolo. It looked deserted, except that the door of one of the huts was partially opened and one closed. He kicked open the door of the closed hut, and the man within shouted out in alarm. On seeing Lesego, he sprang, cowering into a corner. Lesego jerked his head back, indicating that the man should leave the room. But Raditobolo did not run far. He wanted to enjoy himself, so he pressed himself into the shadows of the rubber hedge. He expected the usual husband and wife scene. The irate husband cursing at the top of his voice, the wife hysterical in her lies and self-defense. Only Lesego walked out of the yard, and he held in his hand a huge blood-stained knife. On seeing the knife, Raditobolo immediately fell to the ground in a dead faint. There were a few people on the footpath, and they shrank into the rubber hedge at the sight of the knife. Very soon, a wail arose. People clutched at their heads and began running in all directions, crying,
"Yo, yo, 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 yo,"
in their shock. It was some time before anyone thought of calling the police. They were so disordered because murder, outright and violent, was a most uncommon and rare occurrence in village life. It seemed that only Lesego kept cool that evening. He He was sitting quietly in his yard when the whole police force came tearing in. They looked at him in horror and began to thoroughly upbraid him for looking so unperturbed. "You have taken a human life and you are cool like that," they said angrily. "You are going to hang by the neck for this. It's a serious crime to take a human life." He did not hang by the neck. He kept that cool head above water, indifferent look that he always had, right up to the day of his trial. Then he looked up at the judge and said calmly, "Well, the truth about this matter is, I had just returned from the cattle post. I had trouble with my calves that day. I came home late and, being thirsty, asked my wife to make me tea. She said there was no sugar in the house and left to buy some. My neighbor, Matata, came in after this and said that my wife was not at the shops, but in the yard of Raditobol. He said I ought to go and see what she was doing in the yard of Raditobol. I thought I would check up about the sugar first in the kitchen. I found a tin full of sugar. I was sorry and surprised to see this. Then a fire seemed to fill my heart. I thought that if she was doing a bad thing with Raditobol, as Matata had said, I'd better kill her, because I cannot understand a wife who could be so corrupt." Lesego had been doing this for years, passing judgment on all aspects of life in his straightforward, uncomplicated way. The judge, who was a white man and therefore not involved in Tswana custom and its debates, was as much impressed by Lesego's manner as the village men had been. "This is a crime of passion," the judge said sympathetically. "So there are extenuating circumstances, but it is still a serious crime to take a human life. So I sentence you to 5 years imprisonment." Lesego's friend, Sianana, who was to take care of his business affairs while he was in jail, came to visit Lesego, still shaking his head. Something was eluding him about the whole business, as though it had been planned from the very beginning. "Lesego," he said, with deep sorrow, "why did you kill that fuckabout? You had the legs to walk away. You could have walked away. Are you trying to show us that rivers never cross here? There are good women and good men, but they seldom join their lives together. It's always this mess and foolishness." A song by Jim Reeves was very popular at that time. That's what happens when two worlds collide. When they were drunk, the beer brewing women used to sing it and start weeping. Maybe they had the last word on the whole affair.